Hi, this is Siofra Bradigan, and this is Siofra's Magic Alcove. So, before we get started, trigger warning, I'm going to talk about abortion and abortion rights and reproductive rights and my own personal experiences along those lines, and giving a pagan magical perspective as well as personal experiences. So, if this is a subject that is too triggering for you, feel free to not watch. Anyway, because the subject has been coming up a lot, not only in the internet and so forth, but also in my personal network of people and some of the local pagans that are in my community. And so it seems to me that this is something that should be addressed from a lot of different levels. So first off, the way a lot of people look at pregnancy is that the woman who is pregnant is a doorway between the worlds, and we're offering our body and giving a spirit an opportunity to come in and have a body in order to enter the world, in order to gain experience or do whatever it is that they came here to do. We don't necessarily know what that's going to be, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for society at large, etc. But it is definitely one way of looking at pregnancy. And I know, like with my 2 pregnancies that went to full term, I definitely felt that. I was ecstatic and happy, even though the circumstances under which I was pregnant were less than ideal. My first child, my son, was born just 2 months before my husband at the time, his father, went to prison for rape. And so clearly not the best circumstances, but I was happy, excited, and ecstatic about the idea, whether that was programming from my childhood and all this other stuff, who knows for sure, but and same with my second pregnancy. I was very excited to have my daughter and be pregnant with her, even though my second husband was not as excited about it as I was, and later used it against me. Just sort of ironic. We'll get to that as I unfold the events that took place for me after her birth. So, but addressing the issue, I had a local druid in my community express shock and dismay that I supported women's rights to decide for themselves whether they were going to have a baby or not, which I do support every woman's right to decide for themselves what happens to their body. And his reasoning was it was sad to him because the gods had like arranged all these different events to take place in order to, get the woman pregnant and give a space for a spirit to come in to the world to inhabit a body, and if she decides not to go through with it, then the gods have got to, find another body for this poor wandering spirit that has nowhere to go. That's pretty much how he phrased it, actually, which is a huge guilt trip. I mean, there's a lot of things to unpack in his statement to me about that. For one, it sounds identical to every other religion out there. All the Judaic religions. In Judaism, having babies was extremely important. It was a status symbol. It has to do with the wealth and worth of the man and so forth. And in fact, to the point where if a man dies, then if he has relatives, his brother, for example, will take on the wife that has just been lost so that they can continue the process. And well, it's important to remember with those kinds of stories, whether they're true or not, that seems to be the case, that that was true, that this was happening at a time when mortality for infants was extremely high. The chances of a live birth were extremely low, and even if everything went well, the chances of that child dying relatively young from disease or injury or whatever, because there were no hospitals, there wasn't any way to mitigate circumstance, and certainly it at its core is a way to control women. I believe that is what the whole point of it is in reality, is to control the one who's going to give you progeny and make sure that, she doesn't work for anyone else or decide to lay down on the job and not do her part. And in fact, throughout history, there are so many instances of women who were tossed aside because they didn't get pregnant, even though I wouldn't be surprised to find out at least half the time, if not more, the problem was with the male, not with the female, because of this lack of understanding of how procreation actually works and so forth. There was no such thing as a fertility doctor or fertility clinic in order to find out, if it was the womb or the sperm that wasn't doing its part. And I think, the Catholic Church was definitely way against the idea of birth control, because then you were interfering with God's plans for you as a woman, that if God wanted you to have a baby, he would get you to have a baby. And we're hearing the same rhetoric from some of the far right pastors in fundamentalist churches and things like that in my country, because they're saying things like, if a woman is raped and gets pregnant, if she didn't want to have sex and didn't want to have the baby, her body would automatically get rid of it, or that God wanted her to get pregnant and she should see it as a gift from God, etc., even though it happened in a terrible way and she should get over it, pretty much, which of course denies women having feelings about anything at all. And certainly the Catholic Church was of the opinion, until fairly recently, that women didn't actually have a soul to start with, so our feelings really didn't matter. So body autonomy is apparently a new concept for a lot of people in a lot of religions, including paganism, which was kind of a shock. I expected better from a Druid, but then I have to remember, I have a lot of pagans that I know in my community that are far right-wing assholes because of the way they act. And it's not their beliefs that bother me. Well, they do. They bother me, but it's the way they use their beliefs as a bludgeon to try and force people to comply with their way of thinking, and use fear as a tool and rage in order to get people on their side and whatnot. The whole thing is sick, in my opinion. I don't believe in white supremacy. I don't believe in discrimination. You know my stance on gender identity and the trans community and, whatever, identities people have. Is like, acceptance is sort of my platform. I judge people by their actions, not by what they say they believe, and the actions of these people are abhorrent. Forcing women to have babies they don't want to have, whether they're in Islam or Christianity or Judaism or this Druid guy. It's male toxicity. the idea that a man seems to think he knows better than a woman whose body it is what's good for her. Not that any of you guys are necessarily toxic men, it's just that that is a real push in our culture right now for certain types of men to try and gain control back, like they feel that they're losing it somehow, and they feel diminished. I'm so sorry. Anyway, so a lot of the times women are put in the position of having to justify their desire or need to not have a child. Whether it's cultural justification, like parents trying to set you up with people, or your friends trying to set you up with what they consider compatible potential mates for you to have babies, or the conversation around the dinner table on holidays is why aren't you pregnant and so forth, and shaming women who aren't going to be mothers, who don't want to be mothers for their own reasons, into feeling there's something wrong with them, that they're less than a woman, or they're less valuable as a member of society because they can't fulfill this function everybody seems to expect them to fulfill. That's not okay. And even making women have to explain why they don't want to give birth or have a child is a toxic thing, because in reality we shouldn't have to explain to anybody why we've decided not to have a child, or a specific child, or go through with a specific pregnancy. There's a lot of that kind of rhetoric going around right now that, if it's incest or rape or something like that, then there's a justification on the women's side. And really, there should be no need for any justification at all. It should be entirely up to the woman, in between her conscience and her doctor, and nobody's business. It really is nobody's business why a woman decides that she's going to have an abortion. There's a lot of that kind of tossing about of blame, saying that, contraception would prevent pregnancy, blah, blah, blah. And again, it falls to the woman to make sure that this thing doesn't happen, so she doesn't have to make a choice. And in reality, there are two people involved in every event that might end up in a possible child. And so, I think this conversation started with this Druid guy because I posted one of those memes about why don't men just get vasectomies, because then women don't have to worry about getting pregnant. And he was like very offended by that. Wanted to make sure I knew that they weren't all, reversible, because that's what the meme was about. It can be reversed. Sure, I'm sure there's some that aren't reversible. My response was, well, if you're really worried about losing your opportunity to pass on your seed, go to a sperm bank and bank them. It's like, it's not. There are options. And then so he decided to mention all the different various options that women have for contraception. Every single one of them pretty much requires not just an overt act on the part of the woman, but a potential hazard to her medical condition, her body, changing her hormones, transforming her, and giving her the risks of, depression, suicidal thoughts. There's changes in her body, weight gain. There's just so many different things that can happen, and those are just the moderately uncomfortable things. There's other things that are way more dangerous, like infection and death, that can happen with contraceptions. Very different, different types, including the intrauterine devices, not just the pill or whatever. And his other suggestion was that if a woman didn't want to have a baby and she thought she might have gotten one, then she could take the day after pill or whatever, which is a form of abortion. That's a way to discard the material that might be in there, which is also dangerous to the woman and not pleasant, I'm sure. I haven't gone through that, so I don't know from personal experience, but yeah. And so again, every suggestion and thing he argued with me about had to do with making the woman the only person who is responsible. And there was no sign of any empathy from his part about what it was like to be a woman in the world. And, to have to face the possibility of violence by a stranger or by someone you know, which is probably even more common than by a stranger. So, this whole conversation encourages violence against women and attempts to control women and control women's bodies. And that's what we're seeing in several of our states right now who've passed these horrific anti-abortion laws and trying to make it so women are desperate. And the facts are, of course, that making abortion illegal has never stopped abortions. It's just made women more at risk in trying to find a way to get them. If a woman is that desperate to not have a child, she will do whatever she can to try and stop the pregnancy for whatever reason she has. So, my personal experience with this. My daughter was about 2 years old at this point. So she was born in 75. So in 1977, at this point in my relationship with my husband, I had discovered that his excuse for abusing my son, because my son wasn't his, didn't hold water because he started abusing his daughter as well. And not that any of that should have held water anyway, but I was still in a pretty fractured personality state and trying to figure out what the heck to do. And as I came to the realization that he was going to be abusing both children, I mean, his reasoning I could never understand. I'm apparently naive, or I just can't comprehend this way of thinking that every time he saw my son, he realized that I'd had sex with another man. And I'm like, I was married before. That would kind of indicate that, I had had sex with another man, and how can you blame a child or be angry at a child for existing? And he was very incredibly abusive to my son. My son was a bedwetter, and it runs in the family. My brother and my father both were bedwetters. It's kind of underdeveloped bladder function and deep sleep, not waking up kind of thing. And he would grab him out of his bed and drag him across the room, screaming at him, into the bathroom, and hit him, hit the wall, just kind of all sorts of extremely violent behavior. And so I had come to that realization that I needed to get my children away from him because I didn't see anything changing for the better. I tried going into therapy with him, doing parenting counseling sessions and stuff like that. Some of their ideas were pretty stupid, but I tried them anyway. And because I knew something was wrong, that this wasn't right, and the toxicity of the entire relationship, it was, yeah, very bad. So around this time, I had one of my shared dreams that I've told you about. And the shared dream was the one with my husband Rick, my ex. And I was taken to the top floor of this building to meet a Mr. Abercrombie, and he was looking for a couple to have a child, and I told him that I'd be willing to have another child, but my husband didn't want children, and gave him the reasons why. And he looked at me, he says, that's really too bad because we really do need a couple. And I said, well, maybe I'm wrong. He's downstairs, you can call him up. So he called Rick up and asked him the same question. He gave him all the reasons I had just given him. And he looked at both of us and he says, that's really too bad because we really do need a couple. And I woke up from that dream and Rick remembered it, which I thought was pretty remarkable. And I knew that if I got pregnant again with him, I wouldn't be able to have the child one way or another because we weren't going to be a couple. And that was sort of the beginning of me starting to process that. You know me, I got to have some weird ass thing happen in the middle of all of this other practical stuff I'm trying to figure out. So, my universal connection is trying to give me an early warning sign. So I decided to be proactive, and I had an IUD at the time, and I went to my doctor to see about arranging to have my tubes tied, because I was determined not to give him any more children to abuse and to get the 2 children I already had away from him. That was my entire goal. That was like my focus. And so I went to my doctor, and he said, not a problem. We can get this scheduled in like 6 weeks or so, and we might as well take out your IUD because it's not doing any good anymore anyway. So he convinced me to have it removed, and then he set up the appointment for 6 months, not 6 weeks away. So here I am. I'm now potentially fertile. We know I can have babies because I've already had 2, and I don't have any protection. So we're going to, use the basic methods, rubbers and whatnot. And so I managed to get through most of the rest of that year without getting pregnant. This was, I think, in October or November that I went to the doctor. I think my appointment was in May or something like that. And so then in January, I got the Spanish flu, not the Spanish flu, that it was one of the flus that went around that was almost as bad. The Aryan flu, that's what they called it. The avian, not Aryan. That's a funny slip, considering the conversation. Yeah, I got the avian flu. That's funny. And I was really, 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 really sick. And somewhere just before I think I got sick, my husband and I were in the process of having intercourse, and apparently his prophylactic fell off, and he didn't bother putting it back on, and he got me pregnant. It happened once. So I got really, really sick, and I was like coughing. I have a really powerful cough reflex. I'm now glad to find out that I can take a cough suppressant because I don't smoke and have never smoked, but I didn't know that then. And I actually coughed out the cartilage between 2 of my ribs, the lower right ribs, which was excruciatingly painful because every time I coughed, the ribs were like crashing together. They would contact one another and hit each other. And Rick thought I was being dramatic, overly dramatic. He didn't believe that I was actually in that much pain. And then just as I was starting to get better from that, I started throwing up nonstop. And I just thought, oh no, I was right. I mean, I had that feeling the night it happened, but I thought, well, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, but I was right. So I ended up going to the doctor to try and get an x-ray to find out if my ribs were broken because they really hurt. The doctor was convinced they couldn't break because you can't break a rib by coughing, which I knew was not true because my father had done that. He had broken several ribs coughing. But, what do I know? I'm not a doctor. And then they did a pregnancy test and discovered I was pregnant and refused to do an x-ray anyway. So here I am. I'm pregnant. I'm with a man who's abusing both of my children as well as me. I want to get my children away. If I have this child, I'm going to end up stuck because at the time he didn't want me working. He was one of those kinds of guys that once we got married, I had to quit my job and stay home kind of thing. He always got upset when I taught a yoga class or something like that because I was meeting people and having friends. He moved us around a lot to try and keep me isolated. And I have this dream that I know I'm not going to be able to have this child one way or the other. And so I figure I should make the choice myself and do it under controlled conditions, because if I don't, I'm going to have a miscarriage. I'm absolutely certain of that. And that could kill me. So I talked to my doctor, and he was like, I can't help you. You're going to have to leave. You're going to have to go to the States. I was in Canada, in Saskatchewan at the time. And there's no way I'm going to help you. I go back, I go home, I tell my husband that I'm pregnant and that I need to have an abortion. He yells at me, tells me it's all my fault. I'm like, excuse me, I'm not the one who got me pregnant. and and he then believes that because I want to have an abortion, it can't be his, and I've had an affair, which was like ironic, in a sense, the farthest thing from the truth, because it was his that I couldn't have it. I refused to give him another child to abuse. And so I called the Women's Center for the first time in my life. So apparently I'm going to cry now. And the only reason we have women's shelters is because other women figured this out. And figured out that we were going to need help. So I called them on the phone and I told them about my situation. And they sent me to a doctor 75 miles out of town because we were going through another one of those political, even in Canada, the right-wing Christians were out trying to stop women from being able to make any choices about their own bodies. So I got a friend to give me a ride to the doctor's office. And he was pretty matter of fact. I told him I wanted my tubes tied because I didn't want this to happen again. I needed to know that it wasn't going to happen again. I wasn't going to have to worry about it. And he says, okay, I'm going to fill out this form. I'm going to say that you're desperate and suicidal if you don't get an abortion. And I looked at him and I thought, you don't understand. That's true. I can't do this. So he set up an appointment, ironically, for like the day after I was supposed to have my tubes tied by the other doctor in a hospital out of town. And I got a ride to the hospital. My husband wouldn't help me. He refused to help me. So I'm there, and I'm actually getting prepped for the surgery, and the nurses come in and they say, you're scheduled for a tubal, and we don't have your husband's permission to do this. And I'm like, what? I had no idea I needed to have his permission to be sterilized. Again, property and being controlled by a guy to decide what I wanted to do, if I was going to have any more children or not. And I told them that I wasn't going to go through with any of it if I wasn't going to get my tubes tied at the same time. It was like all or nothing. And so they called my husband. 2 nurses witnessed his verbal assent. And I got to go in. And the surgical nurses that were in there freaked me out. The last thing I heard was, oh, look, she still has an appendix. Maybe we should take it out while we're there. And I'm like, what? And then I'm unconscious. So that was the first thing I wanted to know, was whether I still had an appendix. They hadn't taken it out. So that's good. Apparently I'm going to need some toilet paper. Let me find some here. Blow my nose. So I had to take the bus back to my house because Rick wouldn't come pick me up either. And I, I really would have loved to have had another child. It would have been fine with me, but not in those circumstances. And it was pretty close, like
within a few months after that happened that I left and started divorce proceedings and got my kids away from him. Although he tried to get them back at one point. That didn't work either. I'm very stubborn. But that's the point. Hearing the story might help you understand, but it shouldn't matter. It really should not matter because it's nobody's business. Nobody should decide except the person who's in the situation what's right for them. And spreading around notions like, well, if you don't want it, you should have it and give it up for adoption. You know how many people out there are waiting to be adopted at this point? I don't think that's really a viable option. And, it's you make the best choices that you can at the time. And sometimes they seem to be the only choice. And nobody should ever use that as a bludgeon and make you feel less than who you are because you either don't want to be a mother to a child you birthed. You might want to adopt. You might not want to deal with children. You might have a personality that you feel isn't suitable for that. You have other goals in this life, and that's just fine. We have enough people in the world. We really don't need to force people to have more. And as long as this continues to happen, the fact that the Catholic Church thought we didn't have a soul and didn't deserve the right is still functional. It's that those archaic notions that somehow other people are in a better position to judge what's right for us than we are. I mean, there's so many different areas in which the society at large has failed us. The prejudice against people of color. I watched a documentary about the concussion syndrome that football players have, and the black players that have the multiple concussions go in to be evaluated by the medical staff, and they do cognitive tests and functional tests and all this other stuff. And then in the medical textbooks, there is a formula that they need to apply to someone of color because to adjust the results that they've gotten, because the assumption is that a person of color doesn't start off as highly functional and cognitive as a white person, which is utterly stupid and ridiculous. There are so many things like that that are out there that are built into everywhere we go and everything that we do. And there's a lot of work to be done. And so, when that person I guess I must have talked about the trans community in January on one of my live shows, because that's where she commented that she couldn't, in all good conscience, support me because of my stance on on accepting the transgender. She said in her response to my response, it was like it's a trick that white men have perpetrated in order to be able to go places they don't belong, like getting into the women's restroom. And I was just like, what? Really? Some white guy is going to pretend to be a woman so he can get into the women's restroom to harass and rape a woman? I mean, that seems not their thing. So I commented that it sounded like a conspiracy theory cooked up by white guys in order to keep the trans community down, because really it's a bathroom, and in most countries around the planet they're co-ed bathrooms already, so it's not like the bathroom is a safe space all the way around the planet anyway. But I guess the point of sharing this has to do with, this is about taking personal responsibility for your own actions. I took personal responsibility. I chose, I did, and I had my reasons, and I don't regret saving my other two children. I read, I was going to look this up before I did this, but I didn't. I read an article about the first women's action in the South. There was a plantation. There we go again. Plantain is a fruit or a plant, not a place. Okay. Uh, and the women that he purchased from Africa knew how to keep themselves from getting pregnant, and they made a pact to never have a child for this guy. And they actually ran the plantation under the ground. He went bankrupt because he couldn't get the value. And we say this with, I don't know how to say this because it's horrific, out of the purchasing of his slaves by getting them pregnant and making new slaves that he didn't have to buy. It's like, talk about an economic system that's wrong. So wrong. So it's been something for a long time. I mean, the reason why Margaret Sanger ended up being convicted of, they call it, it wasn't quite pornography, but because she published material that had women's anatomy on it, it was illegal for her to do that. And women weren't allowed to learn about their bodies. We have come at least that far where we can find out how our body works and how pregnancy happens and everything else, which is probably good, because it gives us the power of knowledge. And that's the reason why so many religions don't want women going to be educated. Because if you are less educated, you don't know what your rights are, you're less likely to think for yourself, or so they think. And then you're easier to control. And we really don't need to be controlled. We're perfectly capable of controlling ourselves and deciding who we want to live with, what lifestyle we want to promote, where we want to be, what we want to do, if we want to have children, if we want to go to college, what subject matter we want to take, what kind of education do we feel inspired to follow. There's actually nothing wrong with our brains. And this has been part of it too in the medical community, not just with like people of color, but with women in general. When we have something wrong or something going on in our body, they think we're hysterical, that we're exaggerating, like my husband thought when my cartilage popped out between two ribs. And we can't be trusted to know what's going on in our own bodies. And we're still working on that. So there is such a long ways to go. But I just wanted to put this out here because of the fact that I know of several pagans in my community that are trying to use the theory or, of the gods and nature and so forth as a bludgeon to berate women who make a choice and decide. I'm obviously well past having children, even if I hadn't had my tubes tied. It's not about me. It's about all of you. And the younger viewers that I have, you're the ones who are going to help, hopefully, to change the dialogue between men and women, and everyone and everyone, because that's only one subject that needs to be addressed. So the Women's March, I guess, is coming up this weekend, I think. So if you have one in your area, well, actually, I wasn't going to put this out until next week, so never mind. Maybe I should put it out sooner. But whatever in your community, supporting the women's shelters and seeing what you can do, running for city council or whatever, anything. You know, you don't have to do anything either, but if there's something you can do, if you see something you can pick up and run with, do it. Because it's only with the numbers of people that are willing to be vocal about a situation that change happens. And if we can get that 100th monkey over uh, the top, then we can put a stop to this white male supremacy control of all things that they feel uncomfortable with. So, all right. So I guess that is about talked out, cried out, and whatnot. And I figure if this makes people want to leave, then that's a good thing, because I'm here for people who care, and and I'm willing to share what I know and what I've experienced. So hopefully we can learn from each other, and hopefully I didn't make any of you cry. Anyway, I'll cry again because I thought about it. Okay, stop. So anyway, this is me. Not having any skeletons in my closet that anyone can use against me, because I'm quite willing to share them all. And that's what being a pagan to me is about, being honest and open and taking responsibility for my choices. And then trying to help. So this is Siofra's Magic Alcove, and I'm Siofra Bradigan. Blessed be.